Okay, so we're going to talk some more about Christianity as we talk about Europe after the Roman Empire. So one of the things that led the Roman Empire to fall was it did get invaded by nomadic peoples from the east. A group of nomadic peoples called the Huns came from Central Asia and moved into Europe during this time period. There were other nomadic peoples, including the Vandals, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, lots of different nomadic peoples moving into Europe, taking over places that used to be part of the Roman Empire. And I don't want to take the time to go into lots of Roman history because it's really outside the purview of the course. But I do want to use this map to show you here's the Roman Empire. Here's Rome, the capital of the Western Roman Empire. And here's Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. And this Eastern Roman Empire, historians today refer to it as the Byzantine Empire, which I've written in blue here. They did not call themselves that, but historians today do call them the Byzantine Empire. So Rome falls to, Rome stops, the western half of the Roman Empire stops being a thing. And it's controversial when that happened, but around 476-ish is when that happened. It's important to note, however, that the different nomadic peoples that took over what was the western half of the Roman Empire liked Roman culture and imitated it and wanted to be like the Romans. They weren't as well educated, but they did admire aspects of ancient Rome. However, lots of things that had been part of the Roman Empire, like aqueducts, which brought water to people, and the roads and the buildings, all start to fall into disrepair. The people who know how to repair those things are no longer on the scene to fix them, and they start to become ruins. In the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine East, we could call it, life continues in a more organized and quote-unquote civilized way, where you have a government, an empire that is led by an emperor, and there's law codes and there's building projects. You can see this massive cathedral here called the Hagia Sophia, which is still today in Istanbul, which is the same thing as Constantinople. Yes, there's a song. The church of the eastern half of the Roman Empire evolves in a different way from the West. So we're going to talk about the differences. What you see here on the right is called Orthodox Christianity, or Greek Orthodox Christianity. And during the time of the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine East practiced this idea of Cesaro Papism, which means that the emperor of the Byzantine Empire is more important than the leader of the church. That's a really important idea, and it makes sense because the church is operating in the same place where the emperor is living, right? In the Latin West, it's the opposite. There is no emperor who runs all of the western half of what used to be the Roman Empire. There's no one king who rules all of that. And so the big authority is the Pope, who is the Bishop of Rome, who becomes the leader of the Catholic Church in the West. And here you can see him crowning Charlemagne, the emperor of, what is now modern France, but back then was called the Holy Roman Empire. That was a very loose empire that it wasn't the same as the Byzantine Empire. It was a very loosely controlled territory that didn't have the same kind of structure. Also on the left, this is a picture of a monk working in a scriptorium. That's another aspect of the Catholic Church, is that they had monasteries throughout in different places in Western Europe, where monks would translate ancient works of Greek philosophers into Latin. But that knowledge was pretty much kept isolated inside those monasteries, and people outside of it were mostly illiterate. Basically, the only people who knew how to read and write were monks, and not all monks knew how to read and write. Government in Western Europe was is a concept called feudalism. So the idea is the king has some land and divides the land up among lords who pledge allegiance to the king and pledge to fight on his behalf. And in exchange, they get to run this land for him. And the lords then break that land up among knights who help protect the land and help to organize it. And then living on the land are the peasants, who are most people, who are the serfs. Serfs are people with no agency, no control over anything. They basically are dirt poor, live short, horrible lives, and work the land growing crops that they then give they pay rent in the form of food to their vassals, to the nobles who run the land that they're working on. So this is local government. It's not centralized government. It's not an empire. It's very, like hundreds of different lords all over Western Europe controlling tiny little pieces of land. Decentralized government. So this is a map of the religious differences between the Roman Catholic West and the Byzantine East. You can see, before we get to that part, you can see that there's basically a line running down the middle, and that in the east, to the east of this line, people practice Orthodox Christianity, and to the west of this line, they practice Roman Catholic Christianity. The Eastern Church is centered in the city of Constantinople. They call themselves the Orthodox Church. Their liturgy uses the Greek language, so they do church services in Greek. And the leader of the church is one of the bishops of Constantinople, who's called a patriarch. In the West, the church is centered in the capital of Rome. They call themselves the Catholic Church. Their church services are done in Latin, and their leader is the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. And so gradually these two churches, like this process took a really long time. It wasn't until 1054 that the church fragmented into Orthodox and Catholic. This was a slow process where they sort of evolved side by side and developed different versions of Christianity. For example, in the Roman Catholic Church, popes are not allowed to get married. Popes and nuns are supposed to be celibate, which means they don't have sex ever. In the Orthodox Church, priests are allowed to get married and have families. That's just one difference. They have a different calendar, so they celebrate Easter at different times. They have different ideas about paintings of Jesus and what their value is. So they evolved to be very different things. And by 1054, they have a falling out, and the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople excommunicate each other, which means they basically kick the other one out of their church and, sentence them to go to hell when they die. But neither of them believes that the other one is right. And they form this, from this point forward, you have two separate churches. I just want to remind you, before we get to the question that I want you to answer on the next slide, that Islam is still a thing, and that when Islam formed in 600, it actually drove Christianity out, for the most part, of the places where it was formed. So Christianity began in Jerusalem, but by this time period, by 1200, 1400, it's firmly in control of Muslims living in Dar al-Islam, and had been for a long time. And so the places like Egypt and the coast of the Mediterranean Sea by Jerusalem and Damascus, like all of those places started off as Christian, and with the rise of Islam are no longer Christian. So how did Christianity change from 500 to 1200? So first, I asked you, how did it change from its origins up to 500? So after the fall of the Roman Empire, how did it change? What caused these changes?